Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. The world celebrates Gender Empowerment Day today, but if there's one section that's been visibly and sharply hit, it's women. COVID threatens to roll back gains in women's economic opportunities, widening gender gaps that exist despite 30 years of progress. While this is certainly a global phenomenon, India's situation is more daunting than others. To understand why, let's look at some figures. In 2019, the World Bank noted that India's female labour participation rate, basically the number of women within that age working, was as low as 23%. Compare it to our neighbours, Bhutan 58%, Nepal 81%, China very high 66%, even Bangladesh. In fact, Pakistan's rate is actually higher than India's, and worryingly, their labour trend for women is rising while ours is falling. The problems are multiple. On the one hand, the pandemic has caused greater stress to industries that have traditionally had a very high percentage of women in their workforce. So women are more likely than men to be working in industries like retail, tourism, hospitality, aviation. In all those sectors, layoffs and financial distress has meant women don't have a job. Second, the resurgence of the gig economy, which basically means women working or men working on a project basis instead of confirmed employment or permanent employment. This means women almost always have to give up on specific projects because they're clashing with other responsibilities. And the third and largest, a complete reset in the way we live. Children are now being homeschooled. The situation at home, both in terms of house help and the children studying online, has meant that multiple duties are now getting pyramided in a sense onto women's shoulders. As a result, they are faced with the very difficult decision of choosing one over the other and often have to put their career on the back burner in order to make place for this new normal. Those are just some of the problems. The biggest is a lack of jobs, such as India has not seen in decades, and that is pushing women completely to the side. The numbers are very, very concerning. CMIE has tracked the EPF or Provident Fund data that's been available quite systematically since September 2017. For about a year since 2017, there was actually a monthly addition of well over 1 million subscribers, but that started to wear off in a year. And what happened was that in the lockdown months of April and May, the ratio between men and women actually shot up to 3.9 from lows of 3.5. The deterioration, says CMIE, is very, very sharp amongst women of 21 years of age or lesser, which means that young girls who are beginning to stand on their feet are now not being able to become financially independent. Of course, the struggle for women in the salaried universe is just one side of the coin. With no social security, no job benefits, lakhs of migrant labourers have been helplessly moving from town to village and back to the towns trying to find some work. What's happened in that entire episode is that the women or the families that they had with them have also been shunted back and forth, with their skills suddenly moving from relevant to completely irrelevant depending on where they've ended up. So, for example, there were women who had some kind of semi-skilled employment in the urban areas but had to go back to the rural areas and find that they had no access to work. Or similarly, women from rural India who've been coming into urban India are now either pushed into domestic work, otherwise there's not much option. In fact, the Indian Express reports that the share of women in terms of days of work under the NREGA scheme, which is really the only employment opportunity for women in rural India at this point, has crashed to an 8-year low. The women have simply been elbowed out. The ILO, or the International Labour Organization, in a rapid assessment of the impact of COVID-19, has warned that those who are most likely to lose their work and incomes are casual workers and the self-employed. Now, what does that mean for India? Based on 2020 population figures, the ILO report finds that 3/4 of India's population or working population is actually non-regular. ILO also warns that women are more likely than men to be in that kind of non-regular employment. Therefore, women have or are likely to experience much greater loss of employment than men. So what's happening in these pockets where women are trying to earn an income in the rural and peri-urban space? I spoke with Neelam Chibber. She's co-founder and managing trustee of Industry Foundation. It's an organization that works with communities to skill women. And here's what she had to say about the situation. Let's talk a little bit about the industry community, how you built it, what it envelopes both within the rural and peri-urban space for gender, and how things were before we got to 2020.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. Wonderful to be here. Industry has been, for the last 20 years, been working with women artisans, and we have noticed that it is when the woman is empowered that we see better nutrition, we see better education, and we see better overall positive indicators across the family, and which is what we as a society basically need, right? So for us, it's been very critical doing all the gender empowerment work we do within the value chains. Additionally, since the whole model is built around having the first mile producer accrue the maximum out of a value chain, it's very critical to collectivize them. And one of the key things we've noticed that though we believe that there is a certain amount of gender empowerment required, but women naturally have a lot of inherent collaborative skills. So that's why I think there's so much of an emphasis globally on the rise for women as a just a force that could help ease out all the rough edges in society with the lack of balance. So we've tried to build collectives in the past with men. It's been very difficult, right? Because women naturally collectivize. Yeah, they naturally come together. They naturally work together, right? So I think that's a piece of inherent power within the whole argument of gender balance. That is something that we have been able to work with and take it to the next level.
Let's talk about what it is that you're picking up from the ground at this point, Neelam, because now there is, it's early data, but there is enough data to show that sort of the body blow in terms of the impact of the pandemic has been felt by women largely, whether it is in the urban context or the rural context. What happened in all the groups and communities that you all were working in? What did you see the women struggling with?
Yeah. So as I've shared, we've been working on this scaling up of the collectives that work with global value chains with support from the USAID Power Project, right? And these are value chains who supply to IKEA. And the minute COVID happened, right, we realized that the real aim of our being was just to ensure that our communities were safe, right? So the first thing we saw on the field was that all our teams immediately got into shape and working with the women on the ground, working with the women in the collectives, daily calls were done just to check. And I think what's most critical in a point like this, when there is so much vulnerability in the communities at the ground level, where a lot of the husbands of the women lost their jobs, more than 30% of the women who work with us are sole earners in their families, but the remaining 70% were very badly hit because their men lost their jobs, right? So we saw that the fact that there was an institutional framework around these collectives, the fact that they were in the formal sector and they were not in the informal sector, they belonged to collectives that they owned, and we were there as a support structure around them, that we found that they did not have as terrible a time as we saw with the millions of migrants in the cities, men and women alike, who had to migrate back, who were put out of job, right? So we have been able to navigate through the system we've built COVID in as healthy a fashion as is possible. And the women, the amount of initiative they showed, they immediately jumped on and said, all of them, I mean, all the leaders get on Zoom, because as we do our training, as we scale up, and IKEA has been great, orders are flowing back after the first 3 months, right? Because IKEA is really committed and orders are back and the women are back at work. We've also spoken with the buyers to ensure that the women can work from home, because in our model, work from home is tough because of child labor issues, right? Because our model ensures there's no forced labor, there's no modern day slavery, women do not do excessive overtime. So we take care of all these issues, right? Which is what global value chains are actually looking for, right? They all want supply chains that are clean, that are accountable, that are traceable. Because globally we are seeing that the global customer, and that's another big thing which is going to happen post-COVID, right? COVID, as we all know, is here. It's not going away. And if it's not COVID, it is going to be some other issues linked to climate change, right? And I think it's nations like India which are going to suffer the most. So in these atmospheres, we believe that these models can prove their worth.
Just to go back to the point about producer enterprises led by women, one of the largest problems is that access to capital. Why was that?
Well, I'll be frank. Access to capital is always difficult for women, though there is this whole talk about microfinance. The interest rates of microfinance are too high. You cannot build a competitive business at a 24% interest rate, because end of the day, these manufacturing collectives are competing with China, Vietnam, where access to capital is at 6% or 8%, roughly, right? So I would also say post-COVID, the access to capital hasn't really eased out, let's be frank. It's very tough for all the schemes to reach all the MSME packages that have been, because they are all meant for existing entities with existing loan books. But historically, we have noticed that collectives find it very, very tough to raise capital, right? Because there is really no one there to take the risk and to provide the guarantees. So I would say on the capital front, things are still very tight, right? But we have found some ways out. There are ways out. We've already built an innovative finance instrument with, again, an entity based in the Bay Area, where, again, they're reaching out to HNIs who are interested in investing in gender empowerment, right? And in addition, we also have a lot of NBFCs in India who focus on lending to these producer collectives, who have also supported, right? But definitely there is a dearth at the scale required for women's businesses at a national level. There is definitely still a huge dearth.
The numbers were, as you pointed out, Neelam, in any case, quite depressing. I mean, even in 2019, from what we have from the World Bank, we have one of the lowest female labor participation rates at 23% odd. Anecdotally, when you speak to your community, because some of them, of course, are part of your enterprise, but many are not. What do you hear? Has there been, on the optimistic side, a resurgence of women coming into the workforce in some form and fashion? Or do you think the fact that the men have lost their jobs has made it even more difficult for women to access any kind of, access to income, or not a salary, but just some kind of work where they get paid?
No, I think you've picked up a fantastic point. I think all the struggle that was happening pre-COVID to increase women's labor force participation, which is really dwindling, I think a lot of ground will be lost. Tons and tons of ground will be lost, because there is going to be a huge need, even for the men, to get back into the labor force, and therefore women are going to become a much lower priority, right? We have noticed that it's a data point, right? That 70% of men don't want to even go back to the cities to work. So there's going to be a bigger demand. Historically, we've noticed that why women's labor force participation has been dwindling is because our entire national theory of change was always built on the fact that we would migrate populations out of rural India into urban India for jobs. That's really tough for the women to do. Sometimes they take their families along, but by and large, if you go by the logic of our work in Tamil Nadu, 30% of the women are single, sole earners, widows, divorcees. Therefore, that 30% cannot move alone to cities for jobs, right? They are at risk of trafficking, right? They are at risk of being exploited. So straight away, you've got this most vulnerable 30%, which really needs access to income, which cannot migrate. Then from the remaining 60-70%, how many go with their husbands, then live in slums? There's a huge amount of de-skilling. These are skilled people who are moving into cities as domestic labor, frankly. What else? What are the jobs for unskilled women, skilled in a different way women in a city? They all move into domestic work, right? So I think at a national level, COVID is a huge tragedy, obviously. But it's also a huge opportunity because one can really rethink these paradigms of growth and look at how we can create more work for women who constitute obviously 50% of our population and 50% of our rural and peri-urban population. How do we create work for them where they are, which is safe and which is structured? It is not informal, it's more formal. And so it's an opportunity for us to show that there are models that are possible, right? To move these women into more manufacturing jobs for fashion and lifestyle sector. Because you don't have to move everybody into automotive. There has been this that India will all become a white collar economy, that everybody is going to eventually become a, outsource entity in technology. It's not going to happen. We have to look at our manufacturing, right? And I mean, if you ask any woman in rural India, she wants to sew. Yeah. Sabko, they want to do salai, kadai, bunai. They do it, right? So how do we get them to feed consumer markets? If by 2030, India is going to be the third largest economy, right? So I think it's a great opportunity now, or with all this talk of Atmanirbhar Bharat, with all this talk of local for vocal, right? That we take this sector and we show that how much of job creation is possible, but do not insist on migrating them to the cities. There has to be another option.
This is, it's also a well-documented fact, Neelam, the fact that these sort of community groups work the best for women, both in terms of access to finance. There is high integrity involved in terms of the fact that they don't renege on a loan. It's also well known that these are sectors where you have the prevalence of a large women working population, whether it's textiles, as you said, or hospitality or travel and tourism. Are you a bit surprised that there hasn't been enough done to, specifically target these sectors, which we know are very high employment generators, as also have a large women workforce? There hasn't been anything specific that's being done. Do you think that needs to be drawn attention to?
Absolutely. You are completely spot on. Take nations like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Their development has happened entirely on the back of the women in the workforce. These are two countries, our next door neighbors, who are absolute powerhouses in apparel production, right? India is good in apparel production, but it has not lived up to the potential it has, right? I mean, there is a fantastic World Bank report on India and the apparel sector. Our ex-head of Niti Aayog, Arvind Panagriya, who's from a senior professor at Columbia, has for years been bemoaning the fact that India has missed the apparel bus, right? So all historically, all economies that grew, I mean, even if you take the US, you take New York, you take Soho, it was the stitching district. It was the tailoring district. So tailoring is a way all economies have grown. Yeah, China has been the factory for the world. Forget this. Everyone talks about the smartphones and the cell phones and the Foxconn factories and Apple, but they were sewing apparel for the world, right? And that's been taken over now by people like Bangladesh, people like Vietnam, right? China wants to get rid of 80 lakh manufacturing jobs, low end. Now they call apparel low end manufacturing. China actually wants to get rid of those jobs. But who is going to take? Is India ready? Does it have the model in place to take over those jobs, right? I mean, we've run a collective in Bangalore City. You cannot find an extra pair of hands in Bangalore City because everyone whose migrant was and still is a huge hub of apparel production is already taken. You've got to move these production systems into rural India. Yeah, and it's possible. It's not impossible, right? But you see, expecting private sector to just bear the burden on its own. We deal with two or three of the largest industrial businesses in apparel manufacturing in the country. They're trying. They're moving out of cities because the workforce is not available in the cities, right? This entire Skill India and everything, they're not available in the cities because the cities are absorbing them, like you said, for hospitality, for nursing and all of that, right? And there's just a dearth of how much the cities can absorb, right? So these factories are trying to move out, but then they talk about a lot of issues. And the issues are, frankly, the minute you'll move a factory, I'll take an example of UP. Yeah, you'll move a factory out of Noida. So Noida is a big production hub. Gurgaon is a big production hub, right? You'll move it out of Noida into a district, the next district, right? So, which is like 6 to 8 hours drive from Delhi, or it's 6 to 8 hours drive, 10 hours from Lucknow, right? It's very tough getting the professionals because a largest size of factory needs a designer, needs a merchandiser, a NIFT graduate, production merchandiser. So the talent, that next level of talent is really not willing to move out there, right? So therefore, in our models, we're also trying to build on how do you raise local talent? Like instead of everybody in a Hamirpur district or whatever, just doing a standard BA or a standard BCom, right? How do you get them to do more of these roles like a para designer, a para merchandiser? So that's very much part of our model because you will get the workforce, the women who can work, but then you won't get the rest of the professional layers that are required. So there's an entire ecosystem that needs building with a lot of thought and detail. Yeah.
Finally, Neelam, you have this unique sort of eagle's eye where you're looking not just at women entrepreneurs, but you're looking at them straddling the rural peri-urban space. You're looking at them showing entrepreneurial skill besides being employed themselves. If you had to lay out, 3 or 4 suggestions to whether it's state governments or the central government saying, look, here's this skilled pocket. We need to retain them and do more to get more people in at this point, post the pandemic. What would your 3 or 4 suggestions to them be? Saying, do this now to get more talent in, to get more employment going for women.
Yeah. So, I mean, we always take the Amul example. It's super critical because as a nation, somehow we've given up on the concept that a system like this can work. So Amul was built. It was built 60 years ago. It's owned by 3 million farmers, right? 60 to 70% of the farmers and the people who are giving the milk to the collectives are women. They're all women, right? So even within agriculture, women are more participatory in agriculture. Because if you look at the 7,000 farm producer organizations we have in this country, we've got 7,000 FPOs. These are collectives. At least 60% are women who participate, though the land holdings are in the name of the men, right? So also we've got such a fertile ground in this country of the self-help group. It's there. It exists. None of us are talking in a vacuum, right? So National Rural Livelihood Mission is really working on how it can take the self-help groups which have already formed. So now the next step, it's a very simple step actually. It's not a very complicated step. I mean, why don't we build 6,000 to 7,000 OFPOs? We call them off-farm producer organizations. So India maybe has about 10 off-farm producer organizations, which are linked to this manufacturing, value addition, right? Also, I think for too long, this sector has made it tough for itself by talking about this space as artisanal. It's not artisanal, right? It's creative manufacturing. So these are MSMEs. These are collectives of 500,000 women and they're MSMEs, right? And they are off-farm producer organizations. So NABARD has it on its mandate to set up 2,000 off-farm producer organizations. So slowly we can see the change happening, right? But look at, I mean, you don't have to create a new Amul, but the fact that there has been a successful Amul, it's a $5 billion company. It's owned by the people who produce the milk. At the same time, it's managed by professionals. Now that is the key thing. No one is saying set up a new public sector entity. Yeah, it needs to be. So the words the government understands is SPV, special purpose vehicle, public-private partnership. So essentially that's what we are saying, right? Get hold of a bunch of good, strong private players, right? Who say the largest apparel manufacturers in the country, right? Let's have an SPV. Let's have majority women owners, the producers owning it, right? Because you'll need an ecosystem of support, right? The government has funds to support. The government, I think, is still struggling with the correct framework to make this happen, right? But already we've seen from Smriti Irani, I think a month ago, she spoke at IIM Shillong or something, somewhere in the Northeast, where she spoke about the need for the handloom sector to build producer companies. So the word is spreading now, right? That we have a producer company framework in the country. This is because there's a lot of criticism of cooperatives that they could be politically taken over as they were with sugar in Maharashtra, right? So now there is a private limited company. There's a Producer Companies Act, right? And these are companies that are owned by the women, right? So could we build those, right? And then could we have a management entity, which could be a mix of private and also the women moving up the value chain. I mean, the pure development sector has a critique sometimes of Amul, that how much are the farmers really involved in running it, right? So there is a way to bridge all this today, and there is a very strong possibility to make it happen, especially with this whole Atmanirbhar Bharat coming in. Why we insist so much on collectives and ownership from the side of the women? I think this whole debate around labor laws is a false debate. Yeah, that it's the labor laws that don't allow, manufacturing to grow. It's a false debate. So people want to earn. People want to do well. How do you also make them owners? I mean, you will have this debate if you are going to take all the cream away. Yeah. And you're going to leave them at the bottom. We've analyzed the value chains. So we see how little stays with the worker. And I hate the word worker because then I sound like a trade union. So which is why we call them producers, right? So if the producers are getting a good enough chunk through efficient intermediation, this is a fantastic model. All the poorest global economies grew on the cooperative economy. New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, your most advanced economies, 14 to 18% of their economies are co-op economies. America has more cooperatives than India right now. So I did a rough back of the back of the envelope analysis one day. Just less than 1% of India's economy is a co-op economy. Yeah. So it's something we have sort of said no to for no reason. There's a way to revive it. It's very possible. So that's essentially my thought.
Absolutely. And we are marching towards 5 trillion while excluding an entire swath of the workforce, which is the women. So I think right now is the best time to take a hard look at it. Neelam, thank you. It's been so fantastic chatting with you and hearing your insight. Thank you very much for joining in today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
So on Gender Empowerment Day, here's some questions to consider. Number 1, why have there been no specific measures announced for the services sector in terms of employment and guaranteeing employment? There's been nothing for hospitality, tourism, travel, all these spaces where women are available and working in large numbers. Second, have we considered childcare services in any form or fashion, whether it is for the salaried class or it is for women who are working in the semi-skilled or semi-regular space? What kind of facilities have we set up to help women step out and actually go back into the workforce? Third, have we heard any announcement, and this is crucial, on either health or education spends being increased? There are n number of statistics and data that point to the deep correlation between a higher health and education spend versus what it means for women and their financial independence and their ability to actually start earning an income. And fourth, has there been any discussion with any of the financial bodies or the industry bodies, frankly, on what kind of employment policies need to be relooked at to ensure that the women who've been forced in most cases, to move out of the working mainstream are allowed and encouraged to come back and are given some kind of prioritization in order to ensure that they can indeed keep accessing the financial income that they were getting to support both their homes and themselves. So, on Gender Empowerment Day, I think there are many, many questions that we need to ask, especially for a country like ours.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.